Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the inaugural session of the Strengthening ROK-United States Science and Tech Partnership on Critical Technologies Dialogue, exploring US and South Korea's prospects and challenges in AI and robotics, held with support from the ROK Consulate General of Honolulu and in partnership with George Mason Korea Center for Security Policy Studies. Today's virtual discussion will offer insights on how our countries can achieve policy alignment and synergy to spur deeper research and development collaboration and enhance the flow of investment, talent, and technology amid the fragmentation of regional supply chains, great power competition, and geoeconomic volatility. My name is Crystal Pryor, and I'm Vice President and Director of Research at the Pacific Forum. Pacific Forum's new Strengthening ROK-United States Tech and Science and Tech Partnership on Critical Technologies Dialogue is a three-part online series plus an in-person workshop that will examine the collaborative partnership between the United States and South Korea in AI and robotics, semiconductors, cybersecurity, and 5G and 6G. In this series, participants will reflect on how the US and South Korea can leverage our comparative advantages to enhance public and private partnerships in critical and emerging technologies. By the end, we hope participants will have a better grasp on how the US and South Korea can achieve policy alignment and synergy to spur deeper research and development collaboration on these domains, AI and robotics, semiconductors, cybersecurity, and 5G, 6G. Today's inaugural session will examine US and South Korea collaboration in AI and robotics, and we'll dive into key issues, including bilateral cooperation on AI and robotics innovation and policy, and rising technological nationalism and geopolitical competition. Our speakers will share their insights on how the US and South Korea can collaborate to enhance the flow of investment, talent, and technology amid the fragmentation of regional supply chains, great power competition, and geoeconomic volatility. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video and audio recording of the session will be made available on Pacific Forum's website and social media in the future. Mr. Mark Brian Manantan, Senior Research Fellow and Director for Cybersecurity and Critical Technologies at the Pacific Forum, will moderate the discussion, which will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Cameras will be disabled throughout the session. We're going to have the three speaker presentations together, followed by the Q&A and discussion. This is a friendly reminder to the speakers to keep your presentations to 10 minutes, please, so we can have ample time for questions and discussion. The entire session today will run for an hour and a half. As for the participants, you don't have to save your questions until the very end. If you want to raise your hand or submit questions into the Q&A box, you can do so during the presentations. So feel free to actively engage on that. So today's presenters for our first session on exploring US and South Korea's prospects and challenges in AI and robotics are Emily Weinstein, who is a research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, Dr. Alice Oh, who's professor in the School of Computing at KAIST, and Dr. Bo-Young Kim, who is a postdoctoral fellow at George Mason University. So our first speaker today, Emily Weinstein, is a research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, also known as CSET, she is focused on US national competitiveness in AI and machine learning technology and US-China technology competition. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and the National Bureau of Asian Research. In her previous role at CSET, Emily conducted research on China's S&T ecosystem, talent flows, and technology transfer issues. She's written on topics related to research security, export controls, my personal favorite, and China's S&T developments in foreign policy, lawfare, Defense One, and other outlets. She holds a BA in Asian Studies from the University of Michigan and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining in tonight. I think I'm really looking forward to this conversation. A lot of what I spend my day doing is, again, focusing on a lot of just bilateral US-China relations. So it's always wonderful when we get to have conversations about things outside of that, even if they are obviously very connected. I like to remind folks that the US and China are not the only two countries in the world. And we need to be thinking more multilaterally, particularly in the within the context of US-China tech competition. It's more US, South Korea, Japan, Australia. It's all of our allies. And I don't want to say versus China, but this is a competition where we need our friends on our side. So again, I come at this as someone who spends their days looking at different aspects of US-China tech competition. So I will caveat at the beginning that I am not a Korea expert, but what I will do and what I can do is present a little bit on some of the lessons learned in looking at US-China tech competition that are relevant for the Republic of Korea, that are relevant for the United States, and relevant for that bilateral relationship. So to start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of decoupling. And this comes actually on in the wake of a report that I just published with a coworker at CSET, Tim Huang, where we look at lessons learned in decoupling from the 1990s here in the US, where we actually use the case study of space technology, or more specifically, commercial satellites, to look to pull out some specific lessons learned in terms of uses of export controls or decoupling of that specific industry. And what we actually found, and I'll go through just the two kind of quick lessons. If you're interested in learning more about the actual space case study, we go through the switching of commercial satellites from being considered dual use items to being considered munitions, which had a vast impact, I would say, on the US commercial satellite industry and so on and so forth, which I can get into. But the two big lessons that we learned from this, the first one is that decoupling is a tool of imposing strategic delay. So we think of this as a delaying strategy. And in the context of space or in satellites, we actually saw that because of our switching of export controls, so we decided that satellites were no longer a dual use item, they were a munition, and we were going to classify them in exports as a munition. And we did so unilaterally. I want to say that the US decided to do this without any allies and partners on board. We noticed that China was still able to emerge as a leading player in space technologies and satellite technologies, despite US efforts, particularly again on export controls. But I would also say the Wolf Amendment in 2011, which banned person-to-person collaboration. So anyone who was working for NASA, scientists, contractors, anything, there could be no collaboration with China. So why is this? Why was China able to eventually catch up? Because decoupling, in particular export controls, when used unilaterally, they actually allow countries like China to gain key components, key expertise from outside of the United States. And in this case, in the case study we look at, they were able to gain that information from, in particular, from Europe. The other lesson that we learned in this case was the importance of geographic concentration and how that influences the effectiveness of decoupling. And I want to emphasize this one here because I think this is really important in talking about the US and South Korean relationship. And especially since everyone had really emphasized, again, the significance of semiconductors, I think this is a great case study. Because in this case, we saw that we pull out this lesson that technologies that have a small number or a handful of manufacturers that are concentrated in a handful of countries, these types of technologies lend themselves more effectively to export controls or tools of decoupling, since there were fewer alternative sources. And I think semiconductors are actually now in the 21st century, these are the prime example of this. So in thinking about the future of if decoupling is used, if we want to deploy it in some type of strategic manner. Let's say we decide, again, which I think most of us have decided at this point, at least sitting in Washington, that semiconductors are of massive national security significance. I would say national security encompassing both the military side and the economic security side. How do we go about imposing that type of strategic delay on China, or using export controls to keep China a few generations behind in semiconductors? And I think because of the concentrated nature of semiconductors, again, not just in the United States, but in the handful of countries. And I'll talk a little bit about the Chips 4 alliance too. We can talk about it now, or we can talk about it in the Q&A. But I do think that this is an opportunity for the countries that are the top leaders in the semiconductor supply chain. And I saw recently a statistic that of the 4 countries in the CHIPS 4 alliance, Japan, the US, South Korea, and Taiwan, we collectively account for 73% of the overall semiconductor supply chain. So getting everyone on board and thinking about plurilateral or multilateral export control regimes as they relate to the semiconductor supply chain, I think is a really productive way forward. And I've been happy to hear that, again, that South Korea has been coming to the table on these conversations and they're interested in being a part of this, but also that export controls are even going to be considered as part of this CHIPS 4 alliance. I want to emphasize, though, that again, so decoupling we think of usually in terms of the kind of protect and defend side of our national security toolbox. So again, we're using sanctions, export controls. They're the things that we're doing to again protect our industry, protect our technology. But I want to emphasize that these types of tools have to be deployed in conjunction with tools that are going to help spur innovation, or at CSET we call these run faster policies, or that type of thing. Kind of your quasi-industrial policy. I know that's still a little bit of like the word has a little bit of a taboo still, but I do think in using export controls, if that's one way we're going, we also have to supplement those export controls, or complement those, I should say, with efforts to spur innovation, again, not just in the United States, but with these countries. So with the 4 countries, and obviously we'd have to include, if we're talking about semiconductors, France, the Netherlands, the UK, and if maybe a few other countries. But we have to make sure that we are doing things to spur innovation, both within our domestic systems as well as in a bilateral or plurilateral fora. I do think that, at least at the outset in the kind of very early conversations around the CHIPS 4 alliance, it seems like we're going in that direction. But I'll be very curious, I think, to see where this goes forward, and I'm very curious to hear what my co-panelists have to say about that effort as well. I just want to end my comments here at the outset talking about, so yeah, I've thrown out this term decoupling, and it often, I would say, scares people, at least when I bring it up here in Washington. And I think that the way Tim and I wrote this paper, and I think the way I usually talk about decoupling is that it is and I think I said this earlier, this idea of strategic decoupling. This is not a wholesale separation of the US and Chinese economies, US-Chinese systems, because anyone who says that is possible, I think, is really kidding themselves. I think we've seen how interconnected both our global supply chains, or how reliant and interconnected our supply chains are, our investment flows, and everything like that. And I think it would be completely counterproductive for us to try and cut off everything. I think we need to have broader conversations, both within the United States and with countries like South Korea, to get a better idea of where we have a leg up over China. So people often use the term choke points. So where are our choke points? Where are the places where we are weak and China is potentially stronger, and vice versa? Where are the places where China is weak and the rest of us are stronger, and we have the leverage in that case? I think taking a second and being able to identify those is a really important piece of this. But in my last minute, I'll also emphasize that we do still need to find ways to collaborate with China. We need to, for instance, their money is still going to flow to China. We need to find ways for, particularly in the context of robotics and artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, we need to find safe spaces for our scientists and technologists and engineers to be able to collaborate in a way that doesn't risk national security. I know that's obviously much easier said than done, but I do think there are certain places and certain ways that we can work to collaborate with China, or work to enter into collaborations with China, whether they be investments, joint ventures, research collaborations, with open eyes, knowing, having a better idea of who we are collaborating with in China, what their connection is back to, for instance, the Chinese military and so on and so forth. I do think in the US we're getting better at this, but I think we still have a long ways to go. So with that, I will pause there. Looking forward to Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks. And thanks for staying just under the 10-minute time limit. That was a really great way to frame the conversation, I think, with some of these big picture issues we're all thinking about, both in terms of geostrategics and also the technological environment we find ourselves in today. Personally, I'd love to hear more your thoughts on the CHIPS 4 Alliance, and specifically, I'd like to hear Korea's position on this and what the Koreans are thinking, but also probe a little bit more into that relationship between semiconductors and AI and how we're thinking about those things. So, but anyway, let's talk about in the discussion. So let's keep moving forward to Dr. Alice Oh, who is a professor at the School of Computing at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. She received her MS in 2000 from Carnegie Mellon University and PhD in 2008 from MIT. Her major research area is at the intersection of machine learning and computational social science. Within machine learning, she studies various models designed for analyzing written text, including social media posts, news articles, and personal conversations. Alice, if you would.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this forum today. I have a quite different perspective from what Emily, what the previous speaker was talking about. My focus is on research. So I will talk about ways in which US and Korea can best align our research directions so that we can both continue our leadership in AI research and technologies. All right. So, and of course, there are many, many different topics within AI that we can collaborate on, but today I just wanted to highlight these three. The first one is AI for drug discovery. Second is for AI for semiconductors, which Emily mentioned several times. And then lastly, we can talk about ethical issues in AI. So AI for drug discovery, this is actually a topic that is just worldwide, very popular, and lots of attention has been, people or researchers actually devoting a lot of their time and resources to drug discovery, and of course, using AI for drug discovery. But this is still pretty at the beginning stages, especially for drugs for diseases that are most critical to public health. So, for example, antimicrobial resistance, which is AMR. One of the reasons is that these drugs often don't make a lot of money for the big pharmaceutical companies. So a lot of the research is on cancer or diabetes or other types of diseases that are potentially financially more lucrative. So while these sort of what they call neglected diseases are not financially rewarding, but US and Korea have pretty serious problems in something like AMR. And moving forward, if we think about the next decade or 2 decades, AMR is going to be actually a really serious problem. The problem is that the entire drug discovery process is very slow and it's very expensive. And AI researchers have been talking about how we can speed up R&D, and in all steps of the entire drug discovery pipeline, from looking at protein structure all the way to clinical trials. But at least right as of now, collaboration between AI researchers and AI healthcare researchers is not going so well. I mean, there are obviously obstacles to interdisciplinary research in any two disciplines that we talk about, but especially AI and healthcare seem to have very little overlap in their technologies, their vocabulary, et cetera. But I think things are starting. So because US obviously has leadership in the healthcare research sector, as well as AI, and Korea has pretty good advances in AI and also pharmaceutical or drug manufacturing. So I think this is one direction in which US and Korea can tighten collaboration and actually produce some drugs or discover some new drugs. And then the second topic is AI for semiconductor, which I didn't know that Emily was going to talk about this. So it's kind of, I guess you could call it fortunate, or you could probably just call it's actually a major trend that we're all thinking of right now. So the semiconductor industry, and I have lots of colleagues who work in this area, even though I myself do not. In Korea, obviously, there's a lot, there's Samsung and Hyundai and all these private companies that are working on semiconductor, and they devote a lot of their research in developing new technologies as well. But I think even though we have these large companies with lots of R&D funding, using AI to speed up and make more efficient this entire manufacturing process for semiconductors is also pretty nascent. It is advancing pretty quickly. We see lots of papers, publications coming out in how AI can help semiconductor businesses to better predict what the demand is going to be, to reduce errors in errors in manufacturing and et cetera. But I think it's still at the beginning of the research stage, and to actually have those technologies be used in the manufacturing fabs, I think is going to take some time, and also active collaboration among the two disciplines, as well as global cooperation. So it seems to me that Korea is trying to move forward. So, for example, our university, KAIST, has recently made a department for semiconductor engineering, and this was quite. It has mixed reviews, but I think one of the negative, one of the people's views on opposing starting something like that was because we already have the electrical engineering department who's been doing this job pretty well. But I think the government's push for this was that we really do need lots of students being educated in this to become semiconductor engineers very, very quickly, like in the next several years, right? So KAIST is one of them, and there are a few other universities in Korea that are working on these new degree programs. Okay, lastly, I'll talk about ethics and AI, which is somewhat a little bit more academic than the first two. But I think that if we want to use AI in anything that we do, we need to make sure that these technologies adhere to the ethical standards. What's really interesting and problematic at the same time is that these ethical standards are not set in stone. Nobody knows for sure what these standards should be, and they actually vary across the different countries, and even within the same country. What's an ethical norm for face recognition technology, for example, that is just not clear at all. And we've seen in the machine learning research community, there are many, many ethical problems with the models that are driving the current AI systems. So with something like image recognition, face recognition, or language models that drive these chatbots and machine translation systems, there's a lot of bias, like gender bias, racial bias, religious bias, et cetera, that we're seeing that are just built into these models. And so that means when you actually use these systems in practice, there are going to be people, especially people in the underprivileged segments of the population, that are going to be harmed. And the flip side also is true. The advances in these technologies are going to benefit sort of substantially people with wealth, industries, and companies that have a lot of resources, and universities and other big institutions, whereas the smaller schools and poorer people are going to actually not be able to benefit from these technologies. And this is a very difficult area, and I think the next speaker may speak to this as well, because this talking about ethics and AI requires collaboration between technology experts, social scientists, legal experts, and philosophers, which we're trying to do. We do have these interdisciplinary conferences. One was held in Seoul, Korea, actually just in June, but this is a very, very challenging area. And so I'll talk about what I think are ways to move forward, and then I'll end my talk today. So, I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? So we need to have these dialogues. We need to have focus workshops, I think, interdisciplinary workshops focused on, let's say, for example, semiconductors or AI and semiconductor business, AI ethics, et cetera. And we need to, what researchers always want is research funding, right? So if we can get some alignment for both governments to say, for example, let's invest in drug discovery with AI for AMR or something else. And I think there's also has to be tight collaboration among the industry leaders and the academic leaders. So if we get them together to talk about what we can do to advance the semiconductor business, for example. And lastly, we can discuss with other organizations that are talking about similar ideas, not necessarily the same, but global partnership on AI, for example, is a global network of AI experts who are talking about very similar topics as we are today. So with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a really also just, like you said, different angle to approach things, but of course the research side of things is so important. So it's interesting to hear about some of those topics that researchers are interested in, and also areas in which we could potentially collaborate with regards to drug discovery, AI for semiconductors, and ethics or that standards discussion in AI. So thank you for sharing that perspective based on your own field of expertise. And now on to our final speaker. Bo-Young Kim is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Psychology at George Mason University. Her research includes theory of the mind, morality, social norms, microaggression, and human-robot interaction. She received a PhD in psychology from Brown University and also holds a Master of Science in Experimental Psychology and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology Intensive Program from Korea University. Before coming to George Mason, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the United States Air Force Academy's Warfighter Effectiveness Research Center. Bo-Young, please.
So hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to meet you. And from the previous two speakers, I've learned so much already. Thank you so much. My name is Bo-Young Kim. I'm a social and cognitive psychologist. So in my core, I'm interested in understanding how people perceive, process, interpret, and respond to other people and their behavior. So for a while, my research was all about humans understanding other humans. So I have studied upon detecting someone's norm-violating behavior, how people make moral judgments of wrongness, blame, punishment, and based on these moral judgments, how people decide to make appropriate responses like expressing their moral criticism to the norm violator to deter them from engaging in norm-violating behavior again in the future. And in recent years, I had these precious opportunities to expand my research scope by replacing one or a few humans in the social context I study, with artificially intelligent agents like robots. In particular, I'm interested in social robots, which refers to the robots that are designed to interact with people in various domains, such as industry, like factory, healthcare, education, military, space, and even just mundane everyday social situations like shopping at a grocery store. As we humans welcome more and more artificially intelligent agents into our society, whether they have physical embodiment like robots do or not like AI systems, they have been increasing debates over how we could and should design and deploy these artificially intelligent beings to assist people. You would probably be familiar with these issues, like how we could determine responsibility and liability when there are accidents involving autonomous vehicles, what ethical concerns that may arise when we incorporate robots into healthcare systems, like helping children and adults in need of assistance, whether we could rely on AI and robots to make judgments of what is right or wrong and assign punishment in legal systems, and like how we could design trustworthy chatbots that are not racist or misogynist, and so on. So these days, it's not difficult to find books about philosophers, psychologists, computer scientists, and engineers discussing these issues about ethics and morality pertaining to human-machine interaction. So for example, you can see this book titled AI Ethics. It's literally about AI and ethics. And this another book about robot rights, where they discuss whether as humans, do we need to bestow like rights to robots, and to what extent, like how do you define robot rights, and is it necessary or not? There are like a lot of philosophical debates about it. And also you can see these moral machines, and then it talks about whether and how we should teach robots right from wrong, and whether it's going to be conducive to the humanity or do more harm to humanity. And finally, we have this like really nice book about robot ethics. And it covers a wide variety of topics, including autonomous vehicles and artificial intelligence, robots, and so on. So you can see that it's like a topic that a lot of people in the world are interested in these days. So what I would like to argue is that for robots and AI systems to be successfully integrated into human societies as members serving in various roles for humans, I believe it is essential that they become equipped with a certain degree of moral competence. Admittedly, I think it'll be interesting to talk about what would be the right amount of moral competence, but like to achieve this end, I think it is important that researchers in diverse disciplines, including but not limited to psychology, philosophy, robotics, engineering, across industry and academic sectors and policy makers and governments should create and maintain open like communication channels. So this is because to build morally competent robots in AI, it is required to quickly, because the progress is so quick, quickly identify ethical issues that may arise as these artificial agents get created and deployed in societies. And it's important to concurrently, I place an emphasis on concurrently, conduct research to understand these issues, like underlying mechanisms, and implement the knowledge we obtain from those research studies in policymaking. And so like US and Korea government could like facilitate like creating like the open channels and then have frequent conversations between them. So there have been many researchers proposing ideas about like how we should build morally competent robots. So one example was proposed by Malle and Schweitz in 2014, and they talk about 4 fundamental components of moral competence that we would need to built into robotic systems. So first one is moral core. So it talks about like having a moral representation into the system, and like the robot, the AI system should be able to act in accordance with moral norms, social norms that we as a society endorse together, moral action, and they should be aware of like what is right or wrong, and also make judgments of moral wrongness, blame, and punishment, and also recognize emotional responses that are related to those norm-violating behavior. And finally, the last piece is about moral communication. These robots should be able to explain and justify their moral or immoral actions, and kind of negotiate or reconcile norm violations, and if it's necessary and applicable, kind of persuade humans to make morally appropriate choices. So these are like the main 2 themes I've been studying recently. And the main research question is, could robots serve as a moral advisors for humans? It's kind of bold, and maybe it's too like high up in the air, but like in particular, I've been focusing on 2 specific topics. One is to use social robots to deter norm-violating behavior, which is cheating behavior in this case, and to use robots to persuade people to engage in pro-social behavior, like making donations for charity. So within this 3 minutes left, I'm gonna like give you a quick glimpse of how research exploring the use of social robots to deter people from cheating, as an example, how it works. And here's a spoiler alert. So some other studies that have used robots and their verbal remarks to persuade people to engage, to persuade people to not engage in morally questioned behavior, they've been successful. But in this study that I'm going to present today, we haven't been able to succeed in discouraging people from cheating by relying on robots to give them a piece of moral advice. but I'll go through it. So this study took place during the pandemic. So we relied upon the online crowdsourcing platform to collect data. It's called Amazon Mechanical Turk, and recruited participants from there. And the basic design of the study was that the robot appears in the video, and then participants are asked to throw a virtual die, and depending on the outcome of the die, they were able to get extra bonus payments. So they had this chance to kind of lie about which number they got by throwing the die, because each number, like one of the 6 numbers, was associated with different bonus payoff. So they had a chance to lie, basically cheat. And in this study, we relied upon 3 different ethical frameworks based on deontology, virtue, and Confucian rule ethics. So this comes in, that brings into like the cultural differences potentially between US and Korea. And then robots in the video told participants one of these responses. The rule-based one was to tell them that cheating to maximize your bonus is morally wrong behavior. That's the rule. The virtue, the identity-based ones, the robot said like cheating to maximize your bonus will make you a cheater, like appealing to their moral character identity. And the last condition was about like a good MTurk community member would not cheat to maximize their bonus at the expense of other MTurkers, like emphasizing their social relationship and social roles as a community member. And what we found from the study is that when the robot offered moral advice to participants, it did not lead to significantly less cheating than when the robot did not offer any moral advice. So we had this control condition where the robot said nothing to the participant right before they reported the number they got from throwing the die. However, in later studies, we have been recently discovering that there's potentially reactance effects, and the more participants perceive the robot as morally capable being, the more likely they were to cheat. So it's like a backfire reactance, literally. But the effects of giving the Confucian role ethics-based advice or deontology-based advice kind of mitigated the effect of this reactance effect, but did not overturn the cheating behavior. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to reach me at bkim55@gmu.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Boyoung. Always love talking about robots. It's a fun field, and I would love to talk more about this. Of course, haven't thought too much about the ethics, morality side of things yet, but would also be curious to think about a little bit more about how AI in particular informs robotics and therefore addressing some of these difficult questions. But thanks to all the speakers for really excellent and interesting presentations. I am going to now hand the mic over to my colleague, Mark Manantan, who will be moderating the Q&A and discussion. Mark?
Thanks so much, Crystal, and thank you to all the speakers. We are joined by 3 fantastic speakers who gave very complimentary perspectives on AI and robotics in the context of the United States and South Korea, and how we can deepen collaboration in these emerging fields. And just to recap some of the important points that they raised during the plenary, I think we had 3 speakers who really tackled the different facets of AI and robotics, kicking off with Emily Weinstein discussing about the latest trends of strategic decoupling with China and this growing conversation about the CHIPS Act and its implications to the US friends and partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are playing a very vital role in the global supply chain of semiconductor. And so moving on, we have our second speaker, Professor Alice Oh, who discussed giving us a concrete application of artificial intelligence, outlining 3 main areas where the United States and South Korea are creating inroads in terms of applying artificial intelligence in drug discovery. Also, she mentioned about, again, this growing relationship between artificial intelligence and semiconductor, how semiconductor is critical in AI development, but also becoming more and more prevalent is how engineers are using AI, are using artificial intelligence to design new models or versions of more effective and efficient semiconductors. And I think the last speaker, Boyoung Kim, gave us also building on Professor Oh's discussion on the governance framework underpinning ethical issues surrounding AI. Boyoung Kim pushed the conversation further by emphasizing the opportunities and challenges that underpin building morally competent robots. And given the nascent development of robots, she called for a deeper US and South Korea collaboration, particularly in opening channels for interdisciplinary conversation. I'm very sure that our audience have questions and comments based on these three fantastic remarks. We have about 30 minutes or less left for questions and discussions. And to all our participants, you have two options for asking questions or making comments. One is to raise your hand in the webinar controls, which you can access from the participants tab. And the other is to use the question and answer window. And so to ask a question, you can type the question into the Q&A box and click send. If you raise your hand to ask your question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute yourself. And please be ready to unmute yourself. And as we wait for more questions, I think I'd like to start and lead off with my own question, I think directed to Emily. You've mentioned, sorry to put you on the spot, but you've mentioned about this idea that 76% of the global supply chain of semiconductors are being held by the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. I was wondering if this will also have an impact in terms of the competitive advantage of the United States and its partners and allies in terms of AI development.
Sure, no, happy to answer that. I think that's a great question. And I think, again, as Dr. O noted, the AI research that's associated with semiconductors and that whole semiconductor manufacturing process, those technologies are fairly nascent. We are seeing things like system on a chip technology and other things that are getting closer to that. But again, this is again, I mean to say it is the quintessential example of an emerging technology. So I do think that having such a dominant or taking up such a dominant piece of market share with the four countries that I mentioned, I do think it does give us a great competitive advantage in developing certain types of artificial intelligence, particularly as they relate to semiconductors. But semiconductors and artificial intelligence, both of them are such interdisciplinary technologies that are used across all different industries. And I think I was reading too that some of the folks that were involved with the Fab 4, the Chips 4 Alliance, were also talking about this, how obviously this is going to be centered around semiconductors, but because of their interdisciplinary nature, this is going to expand way beyond the semiconductor industry. So that's a very long-winded way to say that. But I wanted to also just flag quickly, before I forget, some fantastic work from some of my CSET colleagues that came out last week. And if it's okay for me to share my screen really quickly, I just wanted to show this to everyone. This is CSET's country activity tracker. As you can see here, we've called this the CAT tracker, where, and feel free if folks want to read about the methodology here. But what we've done here is we've pulled, or we've tried to rank countries based on their research or based on their AI output, looking at research output, patents, and investment trends. And so, for instance, I pulled up South Korea here. We could filter based on a specific type of AI field if we wanted to. I won't do that for now, just for time's sake. But we actually can go through too and look, and in particular, if we're talking about the US ROK relationship here, we can talk and look and see in terms of countries that South Korea collaborates with on AI papers, the US is number one. So that's a good sign. China is number two. So thinking about maybe if there are ways for South Korea to work more closely with folks in kind of these third, fourth, fifth, and sixth and onward spots in terms of co-authorship, I think is a great opportunity to work again with some like-minded partners, but also some, India sometimes has an interesting view when it comes to AI because it's such a big manufacturing hub. I think that they've got a really interesting perspective on artificial intelligence. So that could be a really interesting collaborative relationship, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to flag this just very quickly. And again, this is kudos to my CSIT colleagues for working on this. But Dr. O, you made me think of some of this, and I think there's plenty that we can learn from the research outputs of both South Korea and the United States, as well as those co-publication trends. So I'll stop there.
Dr. O, would you like to add any reaction to Emily's points, please?
Yeah, I mean, I guess reiterating what she has just said. So US and Korea, there's a lot of collaboration, but as she mentioned, it is difficult and it's sometimes necessary. I think it is becoming necessary for us to collaborate more with other partners around the world. What I see in academia, at least at my school, is that a lot of us are educated in the US. So I think that's where the collaborations come from. And of course, a lot of them are educated in China, or Chinese scholars are educated in Korea, or they meet in the US. So that collaboration, and the geographic distance also helps too. Getting Korean researchers to collaborate more with Canada or UK or Japan, I think that's a great idea. I don't think the government has anything to do that, like to provide extra funding. I mean, the government does fund bilateral collaborations for specific countries. So maybe that's one solution or one strategy to go about.
Right. I think I'll stay with you, Dr. Owen, ask you about, since you're in Korea, any observations on increased public and private partnership on AI investments, particularly from leading companies such as Samsung and other Korean firms. Is there any trend that you're seeing given the fast adoption of AI technology, particularly in not just in drug manufacturing, but also in in other areas that's important to Korea and also in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, definitely. So we're seeing LG, Samsung, of course. Samsung's been investing in AI heavily for all of the industries that they're in, but we're seeing LG, which is like the next, they make, refrigerators and stuff, but they make a lot of chemical products as well, like shampoos and all these household items. And they are investing heavily in AI as well to develop AI technologies that span across many, many different sectors. And also we're seeing Hyundai, which is a car company, as you know. So the cars are also, they've already become big computers, but Hyundai is investing heavily in that. And then manufacturing, just everywhere, all companies, they're educating their employees about AI and programming. It's a huge effort.
And I think it goes, it shows all the more how interconnected everything is in this emerging growth on artificial intelligence, and also, again, the call for semiconductor. I think I'd call on Buyong to just elaborate on, you've worked with here in the United States with the US Air Force on the importance of developing morally competent robots. And how do you think that sort of research is trickling down, especially at the operational level, when we're thinking of deploying robots, for instance, in conflict zones or in conflict areas? And do you think that, given the unpredictability of this environment, in these conditions, in these particular environment, will the hypothesis or idea of morally competent robots keep up with that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think it's definitely in the US, judging from my own personal experiences, research experiences, it's the ethics and morality issues in the domain of human-robot interaction have been receiving so much attention, and a lot of people, like not just in the military, but also civilian people, or like researchers, are interested in studying those topics. And as you pointed out, in the military zones, like during the combats and stuff like that, robots will be more and more deployed into those contexts. And researchers are increasingly paying attention to whether we would be able to add one more a bunch of more capacities to those robots to help, for example, soldiers make decisions during the ethical dilemma they have to face. It's inevitable that they sometimes have to make those decisions. And then but there are some research findings showing that the way people receive robots, the way people integrate robots' decision during ethical dilemmas. Like classic example is the trolley dilemma. And some studies, depending on the structure of experiments, the findings could be varied. But some researchers have found that during these like trolley dilemma like situations where people have to decide on whether they should sacrifice one person to save like 5 people versus like just let 5 people die, they expect robots to make more utilitarian like decisions. So compared to when they're making judgments about human agents facing the same situation. So these are really complicated like spheres, I think, because we don't know exactly how people would respond to robots being engaged in that kind of context and whether they're going to be preceded by robots' advice. But definitely because they're going to be out there in those situations, the researchers are paying attention to finding successful and ethical ways to build trustworthy robots that could really help people rather than doing harm.
Right. I think there's definitely more to discuss with our 3 speakers, and I want to share their wisdom and their expertise with our audience. We have questions already in the chat box, and I think I'd like to start with a question from. Just go through this. I think Crystal has a question. I think I'll follow this one first. To Dr. O, you may want to Dr. O, would you be keen to share or at least your thoughts about this research on artificial intelligence from nearly 30 countries that decides to boycott a South Korean university over concerns about this new lab partnership with a defense company? So I think in terms of international collaboration, what would you think would be the most appropriate or at least a credible approach when we're dealing with sensitive issues such as, killer robots? This is not the first time this has happened with Google as well in the past. And so I think this is the question of innovation versus regulation, or as Buyong would say, the moral ethical dilemma of developing autonomous weapons. Would you want to share your perspective on this one?
Yeah, so this happened, let's say like 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it was a wake-up call, and it was to KAIST actually. So KAIST was a major player in that collaboration with the defense company, and as we all know, and as you mentioned, Google and other companies also develop defense weapons and defensive technologies, and a project like the DARPA challenge, the urban challenge, is what actually led to self-driving cars. So I think there's a gray area and fine line between technologies that are developed and paid for by the defense industry, but they also can be used to benefit civilians as well. So I wouldn't be the one to say we should stop all defense-funded research in AI and other technologies as well. We just need to make sure that everybody is aware of the potential harms and negative consequences that can be caused by these technologies. I think one thing that is extra scary about AI technologies is that some people believe, and it's somewhat true, but like AI technologies have sort of more control than other technologies that are fully controlled by humans, whereas AI seems to be sort of semi-autonomous, right? So, it's arguable whether they're autonomous or not, but they're called autonomous weapons. So the first thing is that everybody needs to be educated and aware. All researchers need to be aware of where their funding comes from and where their technologies are going to be used. And of course, global communication is vital. We have to know what's going on, who's developing what kind of technologies, and how we can develop or discuss regulatory ways to make sure that people are not being harmed by these technologies. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. O. We have so many questions coming in, so I'll move forward. The next question would be coming from Jun Huang, the advisor at Korean Consulate General, and the question is addressed to any of the panelists. I'd definitely give Emily a go here. What are some of the steps we could take to make sure that many of the recent initiatives in technological fields, such as CHIPS 4 and CHIPS Act and Science Act, actually stay true to the declared intention of fostering collaboration and innovation, instead of acting as a set of protectionist policies that reward only a small number of companies and potentially deter industry-level competition? Emily, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And to be honest, I think a lot of that is going to depend on what happens with the midterm elections here in the United States in November. There tends to be a split, where there used to be a split on kind of how we viewed our relationship with China. There now seems to be a relative consensus in Congress. However, on topics like export controls, which obviously always kind of skirt this line between, actually protecting things and almost bleeding into that protectionist side. This has been a debate since, World War II, World War I. I worry that there are some folks, in Congress, particularly on the Republican side, who are worried that multilateral action on export controls takes too long and are therefore pushing for more unilateral action, which in my opinion is usually, although it might have some effects fairly quickly, I would say it tends to yield counterproductive effects down the road. So I think, long story short, I think a lot of this will depend on what happens in the midterm elections. But again, the best way to avoid going down that protectionist rabbit hole is to keep things multilateral. If you keep things either multilateral or plurilateral, with a group of specific countries, you're usually able to, again, make sure that everyone has a voice. At least all these different countries have a voice, and in particular, if we're talking about chips, we're able to get, again, that huge, that almost that 3/4 of the supply chain actually in the room to have these conversations, because that's going to avoid hopefully giving any type of significant advantage to U.S. companies, which I think is a big concern with a lot of folks when we're talking about some of the trade policies or things that bleed into the protectionist side. The last thing I'll just say quickly too is I think it's super important, like I said earlier, that any of these kind of protect and defend mechanisms, again, the export controls, the sanctions, the visa bans, these types of things have to be done in conjunction with something to fill the hole that we are then creating by blocking investment or blocking students from coming or something like that. So I think the CHIPS Plus or the CHIPS and Science Act, whatever the final name of it was, I do think that did a really good job at emphasizing both the protect and the run faster side of innovation. And I hope we can see this practice extend to other industries beyond chips. Right.
Dr. O, any addition to that question if you wanted to rejoinder?
I don't know much about government strategy, so I'll pass on that.
All right. I think at this point we have a raised hand from Drake Long, so we'll give the floor to Drake, please. And Drake, please ask your question.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion. That was a fantastic panel, really learning a lot here. I'll try to keep my question fairly concise, but I'm wondering about any sort of cleavages that could happen in a multilateral arrangement or even just a bilateral arrangement with technologies like this when you move out of the R&D phase and start to get into going to scale on the commercial level. Because the thing that sort of strikes me about things like robotics and AI and semiconductors, the Fab Four in particular, people like Morris Chong have pointed out that these countries are really kind of competing with one another for semiconductor market share. Taiwan's biggest competitor is South Korea, and America is trying to manufacture semiconductors that would normally be manufactured in Taiwan. With robotics and AI, I'm just wondering if there's any sort of vulnerability on that front between two or more countries that would normally work together, sort of a vision like this, and if that's going to be a huge hindrance. My question is specifically about AI-enabled technology and robotics, but if there's something semiconductor specific, very curious about that too. And I open that up to the whole panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Drake. Would like to take your first shot.
Yeah,
Emily?
so I'll say
Go
something.
Go ahead, Dr.
Oh,
Ella.
okay. Yeah. So one thing that these AI-driven companies, let's say like Naver versus Google, right? They're in the search business. They first fight for human resources, right? So these engineers, these AI researchers and AI scientists, there's a big brain drain who are, South Koreans educated in the US, they just don't come back to South Korea because they're paid much more in the US. Engineers who are doing well in Korea, they move to the US to work for these big tech companies. That's, I think, one way in which these companies are competing with one another. Of course, there is collaboration. I think there's much more collaboration, as you noted, at the sort of the fundamental research and technology side of things, right? So when we're developing machine learning models, et cetera, the AI technologies, people are, even across different companies, they do collaborate. But then when these technologies are actually put into the services and products, I think it is true that at that level, they are actually competing for human resources, they're competing for users, they're competing for all kinds of things that happen on the platform, right? So how do we work through that? I'm not so sure. I think through healthy competitions, these companies can all develop good positive technologies that hopefully are going to be better for the consumers, and hopefully each of the governments will try to encourage collaboration along these different companies that are competing.
Sure, I'll just add really quickly, and again, echoing everything that Dr. O just said. But I think, I mean, at the theoretical level, again, competition is what you need in order to spur innovation. Everyone in kind of your Econ 101 learns that. But that competition only helps to promote innovation when you're competing on a level playing field. And I think the countries that we're talking about here, again, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the US, all these companies that are relevant in the semiconductor supply chain, we're all competing fairly. We're competing based on WTO regulations. We're doing things above ground, and we're doing things, we're doing things the right way. The problem comes down to when you're competing with actors like China, and China's not the only one that is adding a level of unfairness to the competition, whether that be through outsized government subsidies. And I know that's kind of a tricky one to talk about when we're talking about semiconductors, because semiconductors in every country are very heavily subsidized. But when you're looking at, again, the government, the role of the government in the industry, when you're looking at, again, issues related to technology transfer, IP theft, any of those things, it starts to kind of skew the balance. But to me, honestly, I'm not super concerned about, for instance, the Fab 4 countries or countries in the semiconductor supply chain competing with each other, because I think that eventually is how we're going to outcompete countries like China.
Thank you so much for those responses. I hope, Drake, we were able to provide a sound, incredible, and comprehensive response. And just moving along with more of the questions that we have. This one is from Peter Hershock. Thank you again, just reading his question. Thank you for all your presentations. Attention that seems to run through all three domains of concern about AI and robotics is that between AI as means to maximizing profit, either for geopolitical or commercial purposes, and to contributing to public good, either for national or global. If the framing narrative is great power, and that's in quotation, great power strategic competition, the global public good potential of digital infrastructure and AI are traded off for control capacities among competitors. How would you suggest negotiating movement toward inverting the competition or collaboration architecture to prioritize public benefit? And with respect to ethics, according to what and whose norms and ethics? I think those are like two different questions. So the first question is, given this debate about innovation, collaboration, and competition that could, affect the production of public good, how can we maybe arrive at a more appropriate approach for competition slash collaboration architecture that would benefit the majority? And I think the second question would be about when we're talking, and I think this is a question relevant to any person involved in AI ethics, whose ethics are we and norms are we talking about? So I think the first question, Emily and Dr. O, if you want to address that, and Buyong, if you want to address the question on ethics and norms. Dr. O?
Yeah, this is a great question. And something that I struggle with as well. So, as an academic, we are very much focused on the public good side. But even as an academic, if we want to have research funding, we need to actually produce something that is potentially commercially viable, right? So the tension is always there. I think the governments have a lot of work to do in this space. Obviously, the Korean government has been trying to make sure that our public services are advanced by AI technologies, but at the same time, the citizens, privacy is protected, their data are protected. So when you go into the public sector, I think the progress is much slower because they have to make sure that not just the majority of people, but everybody is protected from any potential harm, right? So the private sector, surprisingly, is also on board with some of these, like producing technologies for public good. I mean, they probably do it for publicity, but during the pandemic, for example, like Naver used their chat bot service to help the elderly who, with their COVID testing and getting their groceries when they can't go out, et cetera. So they are making efforts. I think the citizens need to also make them accountable, right? So whatever these companies are doing, make sure that privacy is not infringed, the citizens' rights are not violated, and also that they are doing something to contribute to the society as a whole rather than just chase after monetary, reward.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly. So the first thing that came to mind when I was listening to that question was the conversation around export controls and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics. Because right now, again, we have this policy in the United States where our Department of Commerce is supposed to be coming up with this list of emerging and foundational technologies to control. And you get to this point, this kind of fundamental question about, okay, well, how is AI good or bad? And to me, the answer is, I don't know. It depends on the end user. It depends on the end use. It's really hard to think about how to control these types of technologies because, again, AI does present, in certain instances, a very strong case for public good, but in others, obviously, can be used in very, in military situations, surveillance situations, things like that. So I think this is an ongoing debate that's happening right now. The other piece of this debate, I think that applies really more to like the research community and the folks who are doing this type of research is in the United States, we do have this definition of fundamental research. And since the 1980s, since the Reagan administration here in the US, we've had this idea that quote unquote fundamental research is excluded from export controls. And so this every so often this topic comes back up and people say, okay, do we need to rethink the definition here? Because again, the fundamental document that lays out this definition refers to the threat posed by the Eastern Bloc for all, in order to control things for that purpose. So it's an old document, but again, it it frames the definition around dual use research and what can be controlled and what cannot be controlled. And in areas like artificial intelligence and other ones, and bio research, for instance, gain of function research is one that often comes up here as one that can be problematic in terms of, again, there's a public good in releasing this information and having it available for folks to read and study. But in certain instances, in certain types of gain of function research, maybe you're publishing something that gives instructions on how to build a bioweapon. So therefore, do you need to control that? So there's this, again, I know that's not a super satisfying answer, but it's a debate that's happening right now.
Thank you so much, Buyong. Whose
Right,
ethics are we talking about? Whose norms are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you for giving us this important question. So first, to clarify that as a researcher, psychologist, my research interest isn't about like answering this question, but as a researcher, I'm trying to create a platform where researchers and policymakers, a government can come together and then test out different ideas about what is social norm, like what are conventional norms and moral norms. And my perspectives on social norms are that they constantly change. That said, I like studies that I've been conducting, like trying to use the robot to persuade people to not cheat, behaving honestly, promoting the norm of honesty. Some of those norms are quite fundamental and universally applied in general, except for few occasions where like exceptions can count. So I view social norms as constructs that constantly change, even within the same country, within the same culture. We've seen historically that evidence again and again, like people have been updating their social norms and what is right or wrong, the concepts of those things have been changing. So I would say that it's important that we keep our like conscious awareness of these issues, the importance, because what I may be wrong, but my impression of human robot interaction research and AI research is that a lot of times, for fair reasons, like there has been always like a lot more investment in making things work, because it's so hard to make robots function well, do the things that robotists want to make them. Just picking up a glass of, cup mug from the table, it's taking forever to like complete that simple task. But I think ethics and morality issues are debated a lot, but oftentimes come quite later than after the advancement in like hardware and software has been made. So it's important that we have these kind of discussions frequently. And my answer to your question is that, yeah, my goal is to create a platform where people can come together and exchange their ideas and concerns. And I hopefully could be of help of creating experiments where we could test out, because we cannot survey the entire population global wide, right? So, and then do experiments on them. So that's my goal. And hopefully it's not a direct answer to your question, but that's my intention and research goal here.
Yeah, I think also just to add on that, doing my research on AI ethics, it's, there have been existing multilateral agreements, such as or frameworks from UNESCO. OECD is also very active on this front. We also have the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, where South Korea and the United States are a member. And so there are a lot of existing multilateral sort of avenues and platforms discussing like whose norms. And that's always going to be a very tricky and sticky discussion, because as much as we think about technology being global, it's very much anchored into the local context of the population using it. And so I think just to moving forward, but we have so much questions.
Mark, you got muted.
They got muted? Oh my God. All this time or no? Just this one?
Just this last part.
Just this last part. Okay. Always a tech and innovation and cybersecurity forum without unmuting yourself. So yeah, I think moving on with more questions, we have this question from Dongkyom Kim, and he's curious to know how government can promote open channels with AI robotics or industry for information sharing and adjusting policies. Anyone from the speakers would like to provide an answer to that? How are there existing mechanisms or channels for AI or robotics industry to create information sharing and collaborate on policies?
So I can just do a quick plug. The
Please.
Department of Commerce has things called TACs. They're called Technical Advisory Committees, where they actually bring in relevant folks from industry to help give input on issues related to export controls and trade and all of that. I know that's just one example of many, but I think that's a super important one because it allows the folks in the Department of Commerce who are trying to craft controls around these types of very technical subjects to actually talk to the folks who are dealing with these on a daily basis.
Yeah, so here in Korea, there are also committees. So I was on the presidential committee for Fourth Industrial Revolution for the last president. I think the current president has something similar. I'm not sure what it's called, but it is definitely just a bunch of experts from academia, industry, and other government different ministries within the government also advising the president about AI and data and platform technologies, et cetera. I think those committees do and advisory committees do work to some extent. And they don't work as quickly as I would like, but it helps to get the discussion going. And one reason it's not very speedy is because there are so many different parties. Like when we get the industry experts, they often have certain agenda, like they want to have some kind of policy or some regulation lifted or whatever it is. So it's kind of a balance between innovation, of course, and regulation that we've talked about several times today.
Right, and I think as a final question to the session, and also a segue to our next session on the next iteration of the virtual series that's focused on semiconductor, is this question from Nguk Nguyen. He or she asks, you mentioned to Professor Alice Oh, you mentioned that there are tight collaborations between US and Korea on semiconductor and hardware. Can you please elaborate on this joint initiative, or what are the collaboration programs and initiatives? And has there been any results they have delivered so far?
So perhaps it was a little bit of misunderstanding here. So I think when I say collaboration, I'm a little bit at the foundational level, the fundamental research level. So the research foundation, the National Research Foundation in Korea, has a bunch of programs for international collaboration. And I know that they have international or US Korea sort of research centers that are focused on specific technologies within the semiconductor technology. So, but these are at the very sort of fundamental level, like quantum computing, for example, or like nanotechnology. And when they try to, when you go closer to the product itself, I know that our researchers, our university colleagues have had some trouble doing an international collaboration because they have to make sure that these technologies do not cause some national level security threat or something like that. So definitely research collaboration is, and that's what I was talking about.
I think just to end, Emily, any final thoughts about the Chips for Alliance? You've mentioned a while ago that a lot of these initiatives, despite the bullish outlook on them, will really depend on the outcomes of the midterm elections. What do you see are, at least in the short to medium term, impact, at least directives from the White House to ensure that this goes on despite or in spite, amidst whatever happens in the midterm elections?
So I think this is something we see with a lot of these big multilateral efforts. I mean, anything, US, EU, TTC, AUKUS, all of these new kind of plurilateral arrangements that have come out. The success of these entities is going to depend on if the high level officials, our USTR ambassador Catherine Tai, Secretary Raimondo at Commerce, Secretary of State Blinken, if these folks keep coming to these meetings, I think that'll really help to signal to our allies and partners that the Biden administration, regardless of what is happening in Congress, still really values these relationships and really wants to use these fora to have productive dialogues, to make progress, to have these discussions. Because the second the high level official stops coming, I mean, you have those folks at the working level who are doing this, but again, you lose that momentum. So I think that the Biden administration will have to make sure that those folks are still attending, and that I think signals a lot to the leaders in other countries what our priorities are. So I think that'll be super important.
Let's keep the momentum going for this research and collaboration that Dr. O has mentioned, and also for the conversation about ethics and norms underpinning these technologies. And to that, I think I'll close a very fruitful and productive and very dynamic open discussion. And thank you to all those who participated in the discussion today. I will now yield the floor very briefly to Dr. Kwon, who is here representing our series partner, George Mason Korea's Center for Security Policy Studies, before my colleague, Dr. or Vice President Crystal Pryor, PhD, closes the session for today. So just a very brief introduction, Dr. Soo-In Kwon is currently an Associate Professor of Global Affairs and Director of Security Policy Studies, Korea, of Schar School of Policy and Government at the George Mason University. The floor is yours, Dr. Kwon.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this learning platform today. It's something new, but at the same time, it should be something that needs to be discussed at this particular period of time. Well, on behalf of the Center for Security Policy Studies, we are very happy to partner with Pacific Forum to host this webinar series on U.S.-South Korea Science Technology Virtual Dialogue. The topics it focuses are very timely and important, and that warrants a wider audience attention. Our center has been touching upon these issues as security policy agenda under the bigger theme of technology and future warfare. But this dialogue opened up the areas in which stakeholders can collaborate beyond competition. So I look forward to the following sessions, and I believe the next session is on semiconductor. So I look forward to that, and I thank all the participants and audience today for joining us. I hope to see you again in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwon, and thank you so much, Mark, for an excellent job moderating 3 pretty different presentations but very interesting topics. Thank you for our speakers, of course, and our participants for taking the time to join us today. We do hope you'll continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out more about on our website, www.pacforum.org. The second session of this series will be next month, late September, as Mark mentioned, and Dr. Kwon also just mentioned. The next session will be on semiconductors and U.S. ROK coordination on this important topic, which even though it wasn't planned, already came up several times today. So a lot to talk about here, and look forward to diving deep into this. So please stay tuned for more details by subscribing to Pacific Forum or by following us on social media. I'd also like to remind you of the post-event survey, which we'll share again in the chat box now. We would really appreciate if you would just take a few minutes to provide us with your feedback. This is the first in a several session series. So we want to make it as engaging and productive for all of you as possible. You can also visit our event series website. Finally, please stay tuned for the launch of the Indo-Pacific Current next week. It's our official podcast. It will be featuring leading voices from experts and practitioners from across the Indo-Pacific, and they're going to be assessing trending geopolitical issues and identifying ways and means for deeper U.S. collaboration with our partner countries in the Indo-Pacific. Finally, a big thank you to the ROK Consulate General of Honolulu and George Mason Korea's Center for Security Policy Studies for making today's event possible. We hope that we will see you at the future events in this series. Thank you all.